and sisters, perhaps we could call it the first part of the seventh seal, but it is the trumpets that we're going to look at. First of all, silence, then voices and an earthquake, 4 wind trumpets, the first woe trumpet, the second woe east, the second woe west, the beasts of chapter 13. So that's what we're going to be looking at in the second part this afternoon. There's to be silence. In Revelation chapter 6 and verse 12, you remember that from the first part, I beheld, and when he had opened the sixth seal, and lo, there was a great earthquake. That finally completed its work in AD 324, when Constantine became emperor of the whole of the Roman Empire. In chapter 7 and verse 1 we read, after these things I saw 4 angels standing on the 4 corners of the earth, holding the 4 winds of the earth, that the wind should not blow on the earth, nor on the sea, nor on any tree. So we've got 4 winds involved in chapter 7 and verse 1. And verse 2 says, and I saw another angel ascending from the east, having the seal of the living God, and he cried with a loud voice to the 4 winds, to whom it was given to hurt the earth and the sea. So the 4 winds are involved in in hurting the earth and the sea, saying, verse 3, hurt not the earth, neither the sea, nor the trees, till we have sealed the servants of our God in their foreheads. So there was to be a time when the winds of judgment were not going to be brought until a time had come, the sealing process had reached a certain stage. Verse 4 says, and I heard the number of them which were sealed, and there were sealed 144,000 of all the tribes of the children of Israel. So this is an Israelite community. But the 12 tribes in Revelation chapter 7 are not the same as any other 12 tribes in the whole of the Scripture. There are differences. The 2 tribes that are missing, incidentally, happen to be Dan, whose symbol was the eagle, and the tribe of Ephraim, whose emblem was the ox. And it's interesting that in the temple that's built in Ezekiel, the prophecy of Ezekiel, that the 2 faces of the cherubim that are left are the man and the lion. It's wonderful how the Scriptures hold together. So we are an Israelite community, brothers and sisters. We have taken hold of the hope of Israel, that we are looking for the re-establishment of the kingdom of Israel. Israel were constituted the kingdom of God at the foot of Mount Sinai. Ye shall be unto me a kingdom, he says, a kingdom of priests. And that kingdom is going to be re-established upon the earth. And we're part of that community that will constitute the rulership of that kingdom. Chapter 8 and verse 1, it says, when he'd opened the 7th seal, there was silence in heaven about the space of half an hour. When an hour appears on its own, and not in comparison with other time periods, it usually represents 30 years. It's the 12th of a day, which represents a year, so represents a month, 30 years. So half an hour would be about 15 years. There was silence. And at the beginning of chapter 7, there was to be no wind trumpets until the process of sealing had developed. Constantine died in AD 337, and the summary of his rulership was the last 14 years of his reign there was a general peace. It probably went on a bit beyond his reign. Anyway, it was probably short of the 15 years, about half an hour. So we've got a time of peace before the judgments came. But the prayers of the saints still had their effect. And so verse 2 of chapter 8 says, I saw the 7 angels which stood before God, and to them were given 7 trumpets. As Brother David's already said, there's 7 judgment trumpets. And verse 3 says, another angel came and stood at the altar, having a golden censer, and there was given unto him much incense, that he should offer it with the prayers of all saints upon the golden altar which was before the throne. For those that are familiar with the tabernacle and the temple, they'll realise that this is the altar of incense in the holy place, which was the nearest to the most holy. And the incense coming from the golden altar represented, they should offer it with the prayers of all saints upon the golden altar. Verse 4, and the smoke of the incense which came with the prayers of the saints ascended up before God out of the angel's hand. And so those persecuting powers were to receive judgments. By this time, of course, the ruling power has become Catholic. Verse 5, the angel took the censer and filled it with fire of the altar, that's for the altar in the outer court, and cast it into the earth. And there were voices and thunderings and lightnings and an earthquake. So we're preparing for this time of the judgment trumpets. The thunders represented external wars. The Persians particularly were involved at this time. Wars against the Roman Empire from the Persians. The lightnings represented civil wars and wars amongst the family of Constantine. They were killing each other so that they themselves would receive the power. They've got exactly the same characteristics as the great red dragon power, the pagans before them. And then there was an earthquake. It's not a great earthquake, because it only lasted 18 months. But the time that he ruled, Julian was the last relative of Constantine to rule. He had espoused paganism and took the empire back to the worship of the gods in AD 360. So there was an earthquake. And if his reign had lasted longer, then the effects would have been greater. But it brought relief for those that had the truth. It stopped the Christians, so-called, from persecuting the Protestants. And so there we've got an earthquake. All part of the preparation for the sounding of the first trumpet. And so, you've got 4 winds that we've already seen in the first one of chapter 7. And so we call the first 4 trumpets the 4 wind trumpets. And we can see how that fits in with what we've got in Revelation. I'm not going to go into great detail. Verse 7, the first angel sounded, there followed hail and fire mingled with blood and were cast upon the earth. The third part of the trees were burnt up, and all green grass was burnt up. This was Alaric and the Visigoths, the Western Goths. They came against the area of Italy, particularly, and then eventually ended up over in Spain. So that was the first angel trumpet. Verses 8 and 9. The second angel sounded, as it were, a great mountain burning with fire was cast into the sea, and the third part of the sea became blood, and the third part of the creatures which were in the sea and had life died, and the third part of the ships were destroyed. And the Vandals came from right up north and came down and across through Spain into North Africa. They took Carthage, which was their base, from which they acted like Vandals. We know what Vandals are like, don't we? Well, they took their ships over all the western part of the Mediterranean, and they'd land, pillage, take whatever they could, and off they'd go again. They were Vandals. And it was on the sea. And that as we go through the trumpets, I haven't got time to develop this, but you've got a very strong parallel between the trumpets and the vials, which is the next stage. And the second vial has to do with the sea, as you will probably see at a later study. So you've got Genseric and the Vandals as the second trumpet. Verses 10 and 11. The third angel sounded. There fell a great star from heaven, burning as it were a lamp, and it fell upon the third part of the rivers, upon the fountains of waters. And the name of the star is called Wormwood, and the third part of the waters became wormwood, and many men died of the waters because they were made bitter. The rivers and fountains of waters. I had a holiday in Switzerland many years ago now. But the Alps are the centre. You have there the source of the Rhine, the Danube, the Rhone and the Po, the 4 great rivers of Europe. The Alps were the centre of the great rivers and fountains of waters. And it was against the Alps that the Attila and the Huns came. And again, Attila, it was him, incidentally, that caused the foundation of Venice, because he went along the Po and the people escaped to the bits of islands around the mouth of the Po and established the city of Venice. So we've got Attila and the Huns as the third trumpet. And then verse 12. And the fourth angel sounded, and the third part of the sun was smitten, and the third part of the moon, and the third part of the stars. So as the third part of them was darkened, and the day shone not for a third part of it, and the night likewise. How do you get the third of the day? It just can't happen literally, can it? Here is a representation of the heavenly bodies of a third of the Roman Empire being overcome, as we've already seen. The pagan heavenly bodies were cast out. Well, the emperor in the east lost his jurisdiction over Rome and the western part of the Roman Empire, the third of the Roman Empire. Theodoric and the Ostrogoths, various other names involved with him, he established the Gothic kingdom in Rome. and for the first time there was a non-Roman ruler in Rome. Here was a change for the Roman Empire. And in fact, this is the seventh head that is spoken of. The sixth head, as it were, wounded to death, and the Gothic kingdom was the seventh head, which will last a short period. We'll come back to that as we continue. Here's a map. You can see the various colours. The green is the movement of Alaric and the Goths, going down into Italy and then ending up over in Spain. You've got the orange, which is the Vandals, coming down through Spain and into North Africa and spreading all over the western Mediterranean. You've got Attila and the Huns, the blue, going onto the area of the Alps. And I mean, it is a historical map of what happened, how these tribes came across. And it's just how it was prophesied in the book of Revelation, brothers and sisters. These things are wonderful. The more you know of the detail, of the fulfillment, it may be difficult to absorb them, but you know that what God has promised, he will perform. And then you've got the brown that comes and establishes itself and finishes up in Rome. So the first 4 wind trumpets were sent against the western part of the Roman Empire. The 7 heads. In Daniel chapter 7, verse 7, we had 10 horns. He only sees 1 head on the 4th beast. I've got a picture taken in Elat of 1 lamppost. And then you stand over to the right, and you take another picture, and there are 7 lampposts. And that's really, Daniel only saw the 1 head. John saw the 7 heads. Well, chapter 12 and verse 3, we've already seen 10 horns, 7 heads, but the crowns are on the heads in Revelation chapter 12. Let's just have a look at that detail. Verse 3, there appeared another wonder in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns upon his heads. Go to chapter 13 and verse 1. And I stood upon the sand of the sea, and behold, a beast right up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his heads the name of blasphemy. So the crowns are now upon the horns. The horns were the barbarian tribes that came and established their independent kingdoms, ultimately, upon the Roman Empire. They didn't do it until after Constantine had taken over the Roman Empire. And so chapter 13 speaks of the crowns upon the horns. And then in chapter 17, we've got an interpretation for us. Chapter 17 and verse 9. Here is the mind which hath wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sitteth. 7 mountains, the 7-hilled or 7-mountain city of Rome. Characteristic, well known. Verse 10, there were 7 kings, 5 are fallen, 1 is, and the other is not yet come, and when he cometh he must continue a short space. There were 7 forms of government through which the Roman Empire went. 5 had already fallen by the time John saw the book of Revelation. The 1 is, that was the imperial, ruled over by an emperor at that time, and then, as we've already seen very briefly, the Gothic kingdom lasted a short space. Chapter 8 and verse 12, we saw that the Gothic kingdom lasted 70 years, which compared with the time of the sixth head was only a short space. I've got them listed there. I don't think we need to go into any detail, but different types of, different mountains and the 7 governments, forms of government, 7 kings as it's spoken of in the book of Revelation. Well, go back to chapter 8 now then. And we have, I beheld and heard an angel flying through the midst of heaven, saying with a loud voice, Woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth by reason of the other voices of the trumpet of the 3 angels which are yet to sound. We've had 4 wind trumpets. Now we've got 3 woes. And we call them 3 woe trumpets. Fairly logical. So, the first woe trumpet, or the 5th trumpet. Verse 1 of chapter 9. The 5th angel sounded, and I saw a star fall from heaven unto the earth, and to him was given the key of the bottomless pit. Now we've got a bit of a problem with the translation, in that the word that is translated bottomless here is sometimes translated bottomless pit. Here we have 2 words. The word for bottomless is the word abyssos, from which we get our word abyss. In Luke chapter 8 and verse 31, in the healing of Legion, they asked that the demon should not be sent into the deep. And that's the first translation of the Greek word abyssos. So clearly that's the Sea of Galilee in that particular case. In verse 7 of chapter 11, we've got, and when they shall have finished their testimony, the beast that ascendeth out of the bottomless pit, and that's the word abyss, shall make war against them, and shall overcome them and kill them. So it makes war against them, and shall overcome them and kill them. Interesting. Chapter 13 and verse 1. I stood upon the sand of the sea, and behold, a beast rise up out of the sea. It's a normal word for sea, but it's come out of the sea. And verse 7 says, it was given unto him to make war with the saints and to overcome them. So we've got war against them and overcomes them. And Brother Thomas, from the use of the word abyss for them in chapter 11 and verse 7, he wonders, normally it's the word for sea, but you've got this abyss, it's unfathomed, it's not that it is bottomless, you just don't know how deep it is. But he says, why is that used? The sea is the sea of nations. But what would be the abyss be? Well, as far as the Romans were concerned, those nations up in northern Europe, which were barbarians to them, were unknown. They didn't know how many there were. They didn't know anything about it. He suggests that this beast of Revelation 13 came from these northern European nations that eventually established themselves as the horns of chapter 13 and verse 1. Now, back to chapter 9 and verse 1 then. This isn't just the bottomless, just the sea or the unfathomed, but there's a pit associated with it. In Luke chapter 14 and verse 5, the Greek word phria, translated pit, is translated pit. If you've got an animal falling into a pit, will you get it out on the Sabbath day? And that's the word phria. In John chapter 4 verses 11 and 12, the Samaritan woman, she talks about the well is deep, and the word that's used for that is phria. So you've got something deep associated with the sea. Well, we have a wonderful physical aspect associated with the Mediterranean Sea, close to it. It's not only a pit as far as the Mediterranean is concerned, it is the lowest point on earth. And that is the Dead Sea, the pit of the abyss. Appropriate language for this symbolic statement here. He was given the key of the pit of the abyss. And verse 2 of chapter 9 says that he opened the pit of the abyss, and there arose smoke out of the pit, as the smoke of a great furnace, and the sun and the air were darkened by reason of the smoke of the pit. And it says in verse 3 that there came out of the smoke locusts upon the earth, and to them was given power, as the scorpions of the earth have power. And the fulfillment of this was the development of Islam by Muhammad and his followers. Eventually, they were worshippers of the gods all over the Arabian Peninsula, but he brought them all together to the belief of the one God. And when they got them together as the belief of the one God, then they set forward to convert the Roman Empire. Because they regard them as idolaters, because they didn't worship one God but three. How wonderful, brethren and sisters. This apostate system was being dealt with by people that believed in one God. Verse 4, it was commanded them that they should not hurt the grass of the earth, neither any green thing, neither any tree, but only those men which have not the seal of God in their foreheads. And one of their watchwords was, cleave the skulls of the men with the shaven crowns. It was the priesthood of the Roman Catholic system and the monks that were associated with them that were particularly dealt with by the hordes that came across the pit of the abyss out of Saudi Arabia. They eventually settled across northern Africa. They got over to the Middle East, up to Baghdad, and so on. Verse 5 says, to them it was given that they should not kill them, but they should be tormented 5 months. And their torment was as the torment of a scorpion when he striketh a man. Incidentally, this first woe trumpet takes our attention from the western part of the Roman Empire, where the 4 wind trumpets were, to the eastern part of the Roman Empire, where the Dead Sea is, and so on. And verse 5 says they shall be tormented 5 months. 5 months in prophetic time is 150 days and represents 150 years. Verse 10 says they had tails like unto scorpions, and there were stings in their tails, and their power was to hurt men 5 months. They're locusts. When you get a plague of locusts, it doesn't last all year. It comes for about 5 months. It's a wonderful symbol. And they weren't able to kill the system. The emperor was still there in Constantinople. They just took a lot of his adherents away, but they weren't killed. And so you've got two periods of 150 years, which make a total of 300 years. And from the invasion, which started in 632, the Arabs, the Saracens, they lasted for 300 years. They're spoken of in verse 11. They had a king over them, which is the angel of the bottomless pit, the angel of the abyss, in fact, in this case, whose name in the Hebrew tongue is Abaddon, but in the Greek tongue hath his name Apollyon. The use of Hebrew directs our mind to the east, where Hebrew was spoken and now is spoken. The period of the Saracen invasions and domination lasted for 300 years, from AD 632 to AD 932. This really is wonderful when you start to see how these symbols, so appropriate, were so precisely fulfilled. So much then for the first woe trumpet. A trumpet of judgment on these apostate Christians who were ruling in the Roman Empire. And there's a map of the Arabian Peninsula. He got all of that together and joined them and invaded the Roman Empire. Alongside of this, we have what I'm going to call the beasts of chapter 13, because I want to show how the beasts of chapter 13 fit in with these things that we're looking at in the time of the trumpets. So, chapter 13 and verse 1, I stood by upon the sand of the sea, and saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns. So you've got 10 independent kingdoms that established themselves on the western part of the Roman Empire. They acknowledged the leadership of the emperor in Constantinople. It was let's just have a look at what it says in verse 2. The beast which I saw was like to a leopard. His feet were like as the feet of a bear. His mouth as the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him his power and his throne, the word is thronos, and great authority. So you've got a beast system with these 10 kingdoms joined together, but it's got the characteristics of a leopard, a bear, a lion, and a dragon, the 4 beasts of Daniel chapter 7. So we are being told that this is a phase of the kingdom of man. The kingdom of men started with Nimrod back in Genesis chapter 10. The kingdom of man has continued into its flowering under the Babylonians, and then the Persians, and then the Greeks, and then the Romans. We're looking at a phase of the kingdom of man. And when we're looking at the Roman power, we're looking at different phases of the Roman power. So different characteristics are being used for these different phases of that same power. It's still the Roman power. In verse 3 we read, I saw one of his heads as it were wounded to death, and his deadly wound was healed, and all the world wondered after the beast. Well, the one of the heads that was wounded to death was the imperial power in Western Europe, with the formation of the Gothic kingdom. And then that deadly wound was healed. Eventually the emperor from the east took over, again brought to an end this Gothic kingdom. And so, as it were, that wounded head was healed. Verse 11 says, I beheld another beast coming up out of the earth. And it had 2 horns like a lamb, and it spake as a dragon. It comes up out of the earth. There's a contrast with the sea in verse 1 of chapter 13. And a power came up in the earth, the area of Germany and France. In Daniel chapter 7 and verse 8, we have the rise of a little horn with eyes and a mouth. And before it 3 horns were plucked up. Now that is a symbol of the development of the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire was ruled by the emperor in Europe. It started off in what we now call as Aachen. It ended up in Vienna, and the capitals sort of go pretty well in a straight line from Aachen through to Vienna. That was once the emperor was the secular power, but the other horn was the religious power, which was the Pope in Rome. It spake like, what was it? He had 2 horns like a lamb, and spake as a dragon. So the lamb is the ecclesiastical side, the Pope in Rome, and the emperor in Europe. And the horn of Daniel chapter 7, the horn is the emperor, and the eyes and mouth in that horn is the papacy. They join together. So we've got a representation of the Holy Roman Empire being developed. And here it is. Now, that Holy Roman Emperor, he wanted to, well, verse 12, he exerciseth all the power of the first beast before him, and causeth the earth and them which worship therein to worship the first beast whose deadly wound was healed. That's interesting. He exercised all the power of the first beast. Well, that's verse 1. So he's got the power, the same power as the nations of Western Europe. And he causeth the earth and them that dwell therein to worship the first beast whose deadly wound was healed. So we've got the head whose wound was healed being spoken of a beast whose deadly wound was healed. And that's taken on in chapter 17 and verse 11 when it talks about verse 11. I've puzzled over this for a long time. It was only when I was preparing this that I saw the significance of that word beast in verse 12 of chapter 13. Verse 11 says, and the beast that was and is not, even he is the 8th, and is of the 7, and goeth into perdition. It's this resurrected horn that eventually became the Holy Roman Empire. A power in Central Europe which is going to dominate and is beginning to dominate before our eyes in Europe at the present time. It's the German power ruling in Europe that is going to stand up against the Lord Jesus Christ. Well, verse 14. He deceiveth them that dwell on the earth by the means of the miracles which he had power to do in the sight of the beast, saying to them that dwell on the earth that they should make an image to the beast, which had the wound by a sword, and did live. because the beast was imperial. So we've got an image to the beast, an image, an imperial image, a little empire all of his own. And as one of the horns that was plucked up in the development of the Holy Roman Empire was the Lombards in northern Italy. And the states in northern Italy that were taken from the Lombards and others were given to the papacy. He had his own little empire. He ruled, and you go to Rome and you get all sorts of things that are called that are done by so and so PM, the so and so PM, so and so PM. It doesn't mean Prime Minister. It means Pontifex Maximus. The Pope was a secular, a real ruler in Rome and that area. He had his own little empire, an image of the beast. What's the characteristic of this image? Well, verse 16, he causeth all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive a mark in their right hand or in their foreheads. When they're christened, when they're ordained as priests, the mark is the mark of the cross, which was put on the foreheads of children when they're christened, which was in the hand of the priest when he's ordained, a mark in their right hand or in their foreheads. The mark of the beast is the mark of the cross. And verse 18 says, here is wisdom, let him that hath understanding count the number of the beast, for it's the number of a man. His number is 666. What does this talk about? The number 666. Brother Thomas says the names of many modern powers are the names of the languages of their executives and dominant races, as the French power, the Spanish power, the Greek power, the English power, as in the case before us, the Latin power. Their several languages are characteristic of each. No wonder then that the Latin, the tongue in which the image speaks, and preeminently the tongue in which the image speaks, should be selected by the Eternal Spirit as the basis of its name. And I know when I was at school, they still learned Latin, but the Roman Catholics were told to learn Latin because that's the language that they use. It should be selected by the Eternal Spirit as the base of its name. And this sort of cipher was common among the nations in earlier times. We don't do it so much nowadays. But the Greek letters had numerical values. But in conclusion, does Latinos, which is the Greek word for Latin, solve the enigma? I don't know the Greek, or 666. Let us see. And we have the name of the power, Latinos. The Greek letters, numerical value of the letters, adding up to 666, which is the number of the name. That is the characteristic of this image of the beast. It speaks Latin and is represented by the number 666. Oh, brothers and sisters, this is marvellous. Let us see what the Spirit is telling us. Yes, you can make other things and you can play around with numbers and do all sorts of things. But here is what is represented, I believe, here. And I think, it wasn't Brother Thomas's idea originally. It was others long before him that took this word Latinos, or the Latin kingdom, is another one that adds up to 666, but I think this is probably the easiest. It represents the language of the power, just as French, German, English, England, and so on. All right then, we've seen the second woe trumpet, or at least we've seen the first woe trumpet. Let's go back to chapter 9 and verse 14. Because this development in chapter 13 is going on in the background behind these things that are happening, as represented in chapters 9 and 8, 9 and 11 and so on. But verse 14 says, verse 14, saying to the sixth angel which had the trumpet, loose the 4 angels which are bound in the great river Euphrates. Or verse 12 says, 1 woe is past, behold there come 2 woes more hereafter. And so we've got the 6th angel, which is the second woe. Loose the 4 angels which are bound in the great river Euphrates. We're looking again at the east. The Euphrates is in the east. It rises in Turkey and goes through various countries out into the Gulf, the Persian Gulf, as sometimes we call it. Whatever, it has various names depending on what nationality you are and what political point you want to make. But it goes out into from the area of Turkey. It's loose the 4 angels which are bound not in, but by the great river Euphrates. So you've got 4 angels that are held back by the river Euphrates. Verse 15 says, and the 4 angels were loosed which had been prepared. They'd already been prepared before the start of this period that is now being spoken of, which were prepared for an hour, a day, a month, and a year, for to slay the 3rd part of men. An hour, in this case, is 30 days. A day is a year. A month is 30 years. A year is 360 years. And you add them together and you come to 391 years, 30 days. We know exactly when the effect of this trumpet was accomplished, and that was on the 29th of May 1453. And 391 years, 30 days before that, was the marriage of Togrul, which was the start of this trumpet, the first of the angels. 29th of April 1062. 391 years, 30 days. This is marvellous, brothers and sisters. So you've got 4 angels. You've got the Seljuk Turks that come in 1062, the Tartars that come in 1272, the Moguls that come in 1402, and the Ottoman Turks in 1422. Those are the 4 angels that come and kill the 3rd part. Verse 18. By these was the 3rd part of men killed, by the fire, by the smoke, and by the brimstone, which issued out of their mouths. They used cannons for the first time in world warfare. They used cannons to bash down the walls of Constantinople, and they took it. They killed the 3rd part of the Roman Empire by taking over Constantinople and ruled the eastern part of the Roman Empire. How marvellous are these things. So much then for the eastern part. Just let's have a look at what happened in verse 20. They've all been killed, and it says, there are some that's left alive, verse 20, and the rest of the men which were not killed by these plagues, yet repented not of the works of their hands, that they should not worship demons and idols of gold and silver and brass and stone and wood, which neither can see nor hear nor walk, neither repented they of their murders, nor of their sorceries, nor of their fornication, nor of their thefts. That system was still carrying on, just as if nothing had happened in the area where they hadn't been defeated over in the west. And so chapter 11 transfers our attention to the west. Chapter 11 and verse 1, it starts early. There was given me a reed like unto a rod. The angel stood, saying, Rise and measure the temple of God and the altar and them that worship therein. A reed like to a rod is a rod of chastisement, a rod of persecution, and there was a time, there was a measure. But the court that is without the temple leave out, measure it not. It's given unto the Gentiles. And the holy city shall they tread under foot 42 months. And so the court without the temple, the Gentiles, they trod underfoot the holy city 42 months. And the decree of focus came into effect around AD 610, when the Pope was given jurisdiction over all the churches of the Roman Empire. And in 1870, 1260 years, 42 months is 3.5 years, or 1260 days in prophetic times. And you come to 1870 when the temporal power of the Pope was taken away. And incidentally, because he had no temporal power, when you come into chapter 16, the image of the beast becomes the false prophet, the one with the mouth. Interesting. Anyway, they trod underfoot. They had power to persecute the saints over that period. And verse 3 says, I'll give power unto my two witnesses, that they shall I will give unto my two witnesses, and they shall prophesy 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. It's not going to be easy for them. But right from the time when Constantine came to power, they were protesting against the church that had come into power. From AD 312, you've got a period of 1,260 days. And you've got a period of 1,260 years, from AD 312 to 1572. And that is the period that we saw in chapter 12 and verse 6. They should feed her there 1,260 days. It's the same. They make their witness, and they are shielded to some extent. But then finally, in 1572, then they suffered particularly. Verse 4 says, These are 2 olive trees and 2 lampstands standing before the God of the earth. These are the political and religious Protestants against this Catholic system. They're standing before the God of the earth. And the contrast is there with verse 13. They were affrighted and gave glory to the God of heaven. The God of the earth was the Pope. And so they protested. But then in verse 7, when they shall have finished their testimony, verse 7, the beast that ascendeth out of the bottomless pit shall make war against them, and shall overcome them and kill them. There was a massacre of St. Bartholomew's Day in August 1572, which started in Paris and covered most of France. Then there was war against them, and then there was a sympathetic king in France that made the Edict of Nantes. His centre was over in Nantes in 1598, which gave some relief to the Huguenots, who were the Protestants at that particular time, that they should not be persecuted. But then, finally, the Edict of Nantes was revoked on October the 22nd, 1685. So that warfare lasted a long time. There was conflict. But finally, they were politically dead in 1685. It's an interesting visit to the Huguenot church in Berlin. There was a tableau of four. One was a picture, but one had a representation of the Edict of Nantes. The other has a representation of the revocation of the Edict of Nantes. And then there's a copy of a letter from the King of Prussia to the Huguenots, telling them to come to Prussia. And that became, because they were industrious, they became the source of economic power and prosperity for Germany because of that. Some came to England, and again the weaving and so on that was done in the south part of England particularly. The Huguenots brought with them their industry, and the nations that accepted them prospered because they accepted the fleeing Huguenots, the Protestants, from the persecution. So the witnesses and their death. Verse 8 of chapter 11. Their dead bodies shall lie in the street of the great city, which spiritually is called Sodom and Egypt, where also our Lord was crucified. The street is France. The city is Rome. In AD 212, Caracalla said that the bounds of the city of Rome will be the bounds of the empire. It wasn't really to do good to anybody. It was so that he could tax the whole of the empire and not just the city of Rome. Nevertheless, the city and the empire of Rome were one and the same. So a street of the city where this happened was France. It's spiritually Sodom. Even Israel was called Sodom because of their ways, but that's Rome certainly deserved that description. And Egypt, the symbol of the dragon came from Egypt. Ezekiel 29 and verse 3, the dragon in the waters of the river. It's where the Lord was crucified. So it's in that city of Rome that these things happened. And there were 250,000 Huguenots that fled from this persecution. Well, the body lies 3 days and a half. It's got to symbolise 105 years. You can't have a dead body lying for 105 years. So the spirit is ingenious. That's probably an understatement. But a lunar day, I don't know whether you know that the moon turns round at the speed at which it goes round the earth, so that the part of the moon that we see never varies by more than about 10%. A lunar day lasts 30 days. And so 3.5 lunar days will be 105 days. And the dead bodies lay for 105 years. So that's and you take 1685 to 1790, and you have the time of the French Revolution, when the power of the church to persecute was overcome particularly in France. Verse 10 says that they rejoiced at the death of the witnesses. That's a picture in France in the Place de la Concorde, of the place where the guillotine was. And they were raised. The Spirit of life came, and the common people came to power in France. Come up hither. They came in a cloud, in all their multitudes. And there was a great earthquake. The French Revolution changed and laid the foundation of modern Europe. Here is a second great earthquake of the book of Revelation. The 10th part was France. The names of men, in fact it says verse 13, in the earthquake were slain of men. The margin says the names of men. All names of distinction, of nobility, were abolished in France, and they multiplied them. They had all sorts of special comte and duke and all the rest of it. Well, they were all abolished. All titles of distinction were abolished. And for a time they gave glory to the God of heaven. And so the second woe was finished. You notice we didn't get it at the end of chapter 9, because it's here in the West that finally the second woe came to an end. The second woe is past, and behold, the third woe cometh quickly. And that's going to be the subject of the study of the vials, because in chapter 16 and verse 2, the first of the vials starts in the reign of terror, which closely followed the French Revolution. Brothers and sisters, we have a wonderful God. He's given us wonderful prophecies so that we can understand the way that God works in the kingdom of men. The kingdom is going to be established. The exhortation is to hold fast unto the end. Whatever problems we might have, let us hold on to the end, because soon the Master will come. And the apocalypse, the revealing, the coming of the Lord Jesus Christ will be here. Let us see, brothers and sisters, that when he comes, that we may be with him.